Christmas dinner in Albany should have been a warm memory filled with roasted turkey, sweet potato casserole, and the sound of carols humming faintly in the background. Instead, it became the night my face was torn open and my family's mask finally slipped. The living room was glowing with colored lights strung along the window, and the smell of pine from the oversized tree drifted across the dining table. Relatives had gathered forks, clinking wine glasses, half full. Voices raised just slightly too loud. My mother, Linda, was seated at the head, her eyes sharp as knives, ready to control the mood of the evening as she always did. My father, Richard, sat beside her quiet as usual, pretending to be absorbed in his plate. And then there was my sister, Jessica. At 22, she was the golden child, the one who had been handed every excuse, every allowance, every outstretched safety net. She had been drinking steadily since the afternoon red wine, sliding down faster than the conversation could catch up. By the time the pumpkin pie was set out, her cheeks were flushed, her laugh cracked into shrill bursts, and her eyes searched for a target. That target was me. I was 19, seated at the far end of the table, trying to stay invisible, hands folded in my lap. My future rested on shifts at Price Chopper and late-night study sessions at SUNY Albany. I had come to dinner to survive the ritual, not to be celebrated, just to endure. But the pressure in the room swelled, the forced smiles cracked, and the tension that had always been hiding beneath our family's polished surface surged to the top. Linda leaned forward, her voice dripping with disdain. She spoke words that had been circling for months. "Give your savings to Jessica. Do it now. She needs stability." My fork froze. Every relative turned toward me. I felt the old familiar burn of being cornered. But before I could even form a reply, Jessica slammed her glass down, the liquid splashing across the white tablecloth. She rose unsteadily, her voice raw and ugly. "You are useless. You will never be more than the family's failure." And then she lunged, her nails raked across my cheek skin, tearing hot blood sliding down toward my jawline. Gasps erupted. Plates clattered. Someone shouted her name, but no one moved to stop her. Pain flared sharp, but something deeper shifted inside me. The humiliation, the years of being overlooked, the weight of every insult condensed into that one strike. And in that instant, instead of crying out, I laughed. The sound burst from me, unrestrained, rolling across the table louder than the clink of glass, sharper than Jessica's scream. I pressed a napkin to my bleeding face and met her furious eyes with a smile she could not understand. It was not madness. It was freedom. The useless one was not me, and that truth finally belonged to me. If you have ever sat at a table where your worth was crushed by the people meant to protect you, pause here, press like, and let me know if you recognize that silence breaking. My name is Samantha Hayes. I am 19 years old, and if you strip away all the drama, all the noise, all the bruises that never made it to the surface, what you are left with is simple. I am the daughter who was told to be strong, the daughter who was told to figure it out alone, while my sister Jessica was lifted on a pedestal so high she never had to climb a single stair herself. We grew up in Albany, New York, in a modest house with beige siding and a yard that always looked neat because my mother, Linda, demanded appearances remain flawless. On the outside, we were the picture of middle-class stability. Inside the walls, favoritism pulsed like a heartbeat that could never be ignored. Linda is my mother, sharp-tongued and meticulous, the kind of woman who plans a dinner menu 3 days in advance and still finds a way to turn the evening into a test of loyalty. She is a master at control, a woman who can lace a cutting remark inside a compliment so smoothly that most guests never notice. She has always seen Jessica as her reflection, her success story. I was the afterthought, the one she called resilient because that word excused neglect. Richard is my father. He works at General Electric in Schenectady, a man who returns home worn down, slides into his recliner, and disappears behind the television. He has never raised his voice at me, never raised a hand either, but his silence has been louder than anything Jessica has ever screamed. He prefers to keep peace, which in practice has meant turning away whenever I needed him to stand tall. And then there is Jessica Hayes, my older sister by 3 years. She was born with a crown invisible to everyone except my parents. To them, she was the golden child, the one destined for success, even as she stumbled from one failure to the next. At 22, she spends more time at bars along Lark Street than in any classroom or job. She collects excuses the way some people collect souvenirs. Every bad decision is covered with another infusion of money or another lecture directed not at her, but at me, urging me to help, to share, to sacrifice. I, on the other hand, have spent my life working shifts at Price Chopper, dragging myself to dawn shifts to stack produce and mop floors, watching my paycheck stretch thin across tuition bills and bus fare. I have lived the kind of discipline that builds muscles nobody can see. My world is one of planning, saving, pushing through exhaustion because there is no other choice. This is the stage on which our Christmas dinner unfolded. On one side of the table, Linda's sharp eyes scanning every gesture. On the other, Richard retreating into silence. At the center, Jessica glowing with false confidence fueled by wine and entitlement. And at the edge, me, the forgotten daughter, steady, tired, determined to survive. The contrast between us has always been brutal. Jessica struts into family gatherings with new clothes from Crossgates Mall, of fresh manicure stories of her nights out on Lark Street where neon lights blur with laughter. I arrive in jeans worn thin from work fingers stained from handling produce stories no one wants to hear about, early mornings and long hours. My victories are invisible. Straight A's ignored, scholarships brushed aside, late nights rewarded only with more demands. Jessica fails and receives comfort. I succeed and receive silence. At 19, I already knew the weight of bills, the sting of rejection, and the quiet resilience of pulling myself up again. Jessica, at 22, still knew only that someone else would fix it. So when you picture that dinner table, remember this. I was not just a younger sister. I was a survivor seated among people who never saw me, people who expected me to give and give until there was nothing left. And Jessica, with her glass of wine tipping with her hand ready to strike, was not just an angry sibling. She was the embodiment of every year of favoritism condensed into a single furious act. That is who we were when the night broke open. That is why my smile, bloody as it was, carried more power than any scream could have. If you really want to understand why that Christmas night exploded the way it did, you have to go back to the uneven foundation that shaped my life from the beginning. Childhood in our Albany house was not a story of warmth and balance. It was a story of lines drawn early, of roles handed out like costumes in a play, and once assigned, never allowed to change. Jessica was the star, and I was the stagehand in the dark, expected to applaud, but never shine. Our house sat in a quiet suburb, a split level with a tidy lawn my father mowed every Saturday and a front porch my mother decorated with wreaths every holiday. Neighbors waved and thought we were stable, maybe even enviable. They saw Jessica twirl in her new dresses from stores at Crossgates Mall or ride her shiny pink bike while I trudged behind with the used one missing a bell. They saw Linda's proud smile as she bragged about Jessica's dance recitals or art projects. What they never saw was me standing off to the side, holding the grocery bags, sweeping the floors, being told that my strength was in sacrifice. The favoritism wasn't subtle. Jessica got the new Gap jeans, the Abercrombie sweaters, the perfume from Sephora when she turned 13. I got hand-me-downs and the reminder that frugality builds character. Every birthday of hers meant a cake from Villa Italia in Schenectady with candles glowing and guests gathered. My birthdays were smaller, practical, sometimes forgotten until the last minute when Mom would throw together brownies from a box and say, "You don't need much, Samantha. You're tougher than that." When Jessica needed a math tutor, Linda hired one from the university at Albany, paying $30 an hour without blinking. When I struggled with the same subject, I was told to figure it out, to check out library books to prove my resilience. Jessica went to summer camps in the Adirondacks, learning horseback riding and kayaking. I stayed home mowing lawns for neighbors, babysitting scrubbing dishes at a diner near Central Avenue when I was barely 16. The difference etched itself into every corner of our lives. I remember one Christmas in particular when Jessica was 14 and I was 11. She unwrapped souvenirs from Italy that Mom had bought for her on a special trip. She bragged about gelato in Florence, about gondolas in Venice. I sat there with socks and a planner trying to look grateful while my stomach twisted. Dad nodded proudly at Jessica's stories. Mom beamed as if her daughter had conquered the world. And me, I was invisible. It wasn't just gifts, it was treatment. Jessica could roll her eyes at Linda, slam doors, throw tantrums, and the response would be gentle. "She's just passionate," Mom would say. "She's artistic." When I so much as frowned or questioned a decision, I was scolded for being ungrateful, for talking back. Once, when Jessica shoved me against a wall because I borrowed her sweater without asking, I ended up with a bruise on my shoulder. Linda brushed it off, telling me to stop provoking her sister. Richard, as always, said nothing. His silence taught me as much as Linda's words in this family I was on my own. By the time I reached high school at Albany High, the divide was cemented. Jessica had her circle of friends, her extracurriculars funded by Linda and Richard. She went to New York City with school trips returned with bags from Times Square shops, stories of Broadway shows. I, on the other hand, walked home in the snow after debate club meetings carrying books in a backpack that had already lost one strap. When I got my first job at a greasy fast food joint off the highway, I came home smelling like fries and fryer oil, my hands raw from scrubbing. Jessica complained that her dance classes left her exhausted. Mom cooed and rubbed her shoulders while I slipped past unnoticed to do my homework in silence. Money was always the unspoken theme. For Jessica, it flowed easily. For me, it was scarce earned penny by penny. When she wanted a new laptop after spilling coffee on hers during a shopping trip, Dad suggested I loan her money from what I had saved for college textbooks. I refused, quietly knowing the storm it would stir, but for once holding my ground. The resentment burned, but I swallowed it. There was no point fighting battles that were rigged. Still, I kept pushing. I filled out scholarship forms, spent hours at the Albany Public Library, researching deadlines, pieced together applications with no help. Jessica announced she was accepted to a private university in Boston. Linda and Richard raided savings they had sworn were for both of us paying her tuition as if it were their destiny. Meanwhile, I had to start at community college commuting by bus, juggling 2 jobs to cover fees. Jessica partied on Cape Cod weekends, posted photos of brunches while I rationed groceries, and prayed my beat-up Honda would survive another winter. My living situations told the story too. My first dorm was a shoebox crammed with 3 roommates, one of whom constantly skipped rent, leaving me to scramble for my share of utilities. Later, I rented moldy apartments with leaky roofs, landlords hiking rent every 6 months. One storm destroyed half my textbooks. I taped them back together and kept studying. Jessica, meanwhile, lounged in trendy apartments, bills quietly covered by Linda and Richard. Holidays became the cruelest reminders. Family dinners where my straight A's were ignored while Jessica's internship arranged by Dad's connection was praised as genius. One year, I mentioned my struggle with tuition. Linda waved her hand. "You'll figure it out. You're tough. Jessica needs to focus on her future." I sat there, choking down turkey and resentment, realizing that toughness was the only gift they would ever give me. And yet, despite the neglect, I found pride in my struggle. I tracked every dollar building an emergency fund that started with $10 and $20 increments. I wrote it in a notebook, the numbers climbing slowly. 500, 1,000, then 5,000. Each milestone felt fragile, one bad month away from collapse, but it was mine. No one could take credit for it but me. Meanwhile, Jessica's indulgences escalated. Shopping sprees, weekend trips, endless charges on the family credit card. And somehow, when Mom showed off her new handbag or Dad flashed a watch, I realized my occasional contributions to groceries or car repairs were being funneled into Jessica's whims. The betrayal was constant, quiet, and relentless. By the time I neared graduation, the contrast was stark. Jessica had bounced between majors, then dropped out altogether, spinning stories about becoming an influencer, an event planner, a photographer. None lasted. I, with my exhaustion and ramen dinners, had managed to line up enough credits and savings to transfer into SUNY Albany. It was a victory that tasted like ashes because at home it meant nothing. Linda and Richard only asked if I could help Jessica find stability, maybe let her share my apartment when I moved out. That was the backdrop of my young life, one daughter celebrated for illusions, the other pushed into the shadows but forced to build real strength. It hardened me. It sharpened me. It left me with scars long before Jessica's nails cut into my face that Christmas night. And yet without those years, without that constant neglect and unfairness, I would not have learned how to smile through blood. I would not have gathered the quiet power of endurance. The favoritism that was meant to crush me became the furnace that shaped me. When you hear me laugh at the dinner table, when you imagine the gasps and the shock, remember this history. It was not sudden. It was not madness. It was decades in the making. Jessica was always the chosen one. Linda was always the enabler. Richard was always the ghost. And I was always the survivor, biding my time, waiting for the night when the truth would finally break free. When I think back on my teenage years in Albany, I remember the smell of coffee more than the sound of music, the ache of sore feet more than the thrill of school dances. By the time I was 16, I had already learned that survival meant work, and work meant sacrifice. While Jessica stumbled through her days, cushioned by excuses and handouts, I built my life shift by shift, dollar by dollar. My first real job was at Dunkin' Donuts on Central Avenue. I took the morning shift starting at 5 in the morning, the world still dark, and the sidewalks slick with frost in the winter. I would tie my apron, pull my hair back, and stand behind the counter, greeting bleary-eyed commuters desperate for caffeine. My hands smelled of sugar glaze and espresso grounds, my shoes sticky from spilled syrup. Customers barked orders without eye contact, and I learned quickly that smiling through exhaustion kept the line moving faster than arguing. Those paychecks were thin, but everyone mattered. After school, I worked shifts at a campus bookstore, stocking shelves with heavy cartons of textbooks and ringing up purchases for students who looked at me as if I were invisible. Some nights, I added babysitting jobs, watching neighborhood kids while their parents enjoyed dinners out. I counted every dollar, tucked cash into envelopes, and wrote the totals in my notebook. $10, $20. Slowly, the numbers crept upward. Jessica, meanwhile, talked about art school, about creative projects that never materialized. She dropped out of her Boston program after a semester, claiming it stifled her creativity. Linda and Richard consoled her with a trip to New York City, buying her clothes from boutiques on Fifth Avenue. They came back glowing with pride, as if failure could be disguised with new outfits. I, on the other hand, was invisible. When I earned straight A's when I received letters of merit from Albany High School, the announcements at the dinner table were met with nods and quick pivots back to Jessica's struggles. When she landed a part-time gig as an event assistant, it was celebrated with champagne. When she quit after 2 weeks blaming stress, Linda insisted she needed rest. There was no rest for me. I commuted to community college first, using the CDTA buses that rattled through Albany. My backpack was heavy with secondhand textbooks, some purchased online, with pages already highlighted by strangers. I ate peanut butter sandwiches between classes, drank free water from fountains, skipped outings with friends because the cost of a movie ticket felt like betrayal to my savings account. At night, I returned to Dunkin' Donuts, scrubbing counters, restocking napkins, mopping floors until the tiles gleamed. I often left close to midnight, the streets empty. The bus ride home silent, except for the hum of fluorescent lights. I would collapse onto my bed in a shared apartment that smelled faintly of mildew walls, thin enough to hear my roommate fighting with her boyfriend. I wore headphones to drown out the noise and opened my notebook to update the savings tally. That notebook became my lifeline. The first time I wrote down $500, I nearly cried. It was proof that my effort was not disappearing into thin air. When I reached 1,000, I celebrated alone with a cheap cup of hot cocoa, letting the warmth remind me that I was building something nobody could take. Jessica was building nothing. She posted photos on social media from bars on Lark Street, drinks in hand, friends cheering around her. She wore new clothes, posed with manicures, claimed she was exploring career options. Behind the scenes, Linda and Richard poured money into her rent, her credit card debt, her impulsive purchases. They told relatives Jessica was finding herself. They told me to help more, to share my savings, to remember that family comes first. The guilt was constant. Linda's voice followed me even in my sleep. Jessica needs you. You're strong, Samantha. She's fragile. At first, I believed it. I lent her money once, $50 for groceries she claimed she couldn't afford. 2 days later, I saw a photo of her at a restaurant in Saratoga Springs, wine glass raised. My stomach twisted. That was the day I stopped giving. Still, the pressure never ended. When Jessica spilled coffee on her laptop, Dad suggested I loan her money for a replacement. When their car needed repairs, Linda hinted that I should chip in. Each time I hesitated, the room filled with disappointment, as if my refusal was betrayal. Yet no one asked Jessica to give up a manicure to skip a brunch to take a job. At 18, I finally transferred to SUNY Albany, moving out of the crumbling apartment into another shared space off Western Avenue. It was better, but still rough. The landlord ignored leaks the neighbors threw parties on weeknights, and rent consumed half my paycheck. Still, I clung to my studies, determined to finish what I had started. I majored in business, hoping it would someday lead to stability beyond constant hustling. The sacrifices deepened. I skipped spring breaks, taking extra shifts at Dunkin' and the bookstore instead. While Jessica traveled with friends, I scrubbed coffee machines clogged with grounds my nails stained brown. I missed concerts, birthdays, carefree moments because every dollar mattered. My friends stopped inviting me after a while, tired of hearing no. Loneliness pressed in, but I reminded myself of the bigger picture. Survival first. The divide grew sharper during holidays. At Thanksgiving, Linda praised Jessica's resilience for trying out a photography course that she quit after 2 weeks. My achievements were ignored. At Christmas, Jessica unwrapped jewelry gadgets' expensive coats. I unwrapped socks and planners, the same refrain. You're practical, Samantha. You don't need luxuries. By 19, my savings had reached $5,000. It felt monumental. I imagined putting it toward a down payment someday or using it to secure a future beyond Albany's shadow. That hope became my fuel. Each morning at 5, I tied my apron tighter each night. I dragged myself through exhaustion because I knew I was investing in freedom. Meanwhile, Jessica's failures piled up. She announced plans to become a social media influencer, filming videos in our parents' living room. She bought ring lights and props with Linda's credit card, then abandoned the project within months. She tried event planning again, lasted a month, then quit. She told relatives she was misunderstood, artistic, too special for ordinary jobs. Linda nodded. Richard stayed silent, and the cycle spun on. I learned to carry my resentment quietly. On the outside, I kept my head down, worked, studied, endured. Inside, I built walls. I knew nobody would catch me if I fell. I stopped expecting praise, stopped seeking fairness. I focused only on the numbers in my notebook, the proof that I was moving forward. Looking back, those years hardened me in ways Jessica never experienced. She thought strength was having people bail her out. I learned that strength was swallowing disappointment, carrying burdens alone, and still showing up to class the next morning. She thought independence meant freedom from responsibility. I learned that independence meant surviving without anyone's safety net. By the time the Christmas dinner of my 19th year arrived, the contrast between us was undeniable. Jessica was still drinking, still wasting opportunities, still wrapped in the illusion that the world owed her. I was scarred by long hours, exhaustion, loneliness, but armed with the resilience of someone who had already weathered storms alone. That is why the moment she clawed my face, when blood slid hot down my cheek, I did not break. It was not new pain. It was only the physical mark of years of unseen wounds. And that is why I laughed. Because long before the table gasped, long before Linda's eyes widened, long before Richard's silence deepened, I already knew. I had struggled and hustled and survived enough to understand the useless one was never me. By the time I entered my second semester at SUNY Albany, the rhythm of my life had become almost mechanical. Work, study, sleep, repeat. It was grueling, but I carried a quiet pride because I was moving forward on my own. My notebook of savings had become my shield. At 19, I was already looking toward the future, sketching plans for what independence could truly mean. Jessica, meanwhile, remained adrift. She dropped out of her latest program, spent evenings hopping from one bar on Lark Street to another, and returned home in the early mornings with stories of wild nights. Linda still called her brilliant. Richard still looked away. Then came the shift that changed everything, the first crack that revealed just how far they were willing to go. It happened in the most ordinary way, an email. I was at the library one afternoon, hunched over a textbook, when my phone buzzed with a notification. The subject line was short, Jessica's future. I assumed it was spam at first, but the sender stopped me cold. It was from my mother. I opened it, confusion turning to disbelief as I scrolled. Linda had written to Richard detailing a plan to ensure Jessica's stability. She described how once I graduated, I would naturally purchase a condo. The savings I had worked for the financial discipline that had cost me sleep and friendships would be redirected. The condo would not be for me, but for Jessica. The email included phrases that carved themselves into my mind. Samantha is responsible. She will do it. Jessica deserves a break. My breath caught in my throat. I read it again, searching for some misunderstanding, but there was none. And then I saw why the email had reached me. Linda had forwarded it to Richard, adding notes about neighborhoods near Lincoln Park, but when she typed the addresses, she must have hit autocomplete. Instead of sending it only to him, she had CC'd me. An accident, a mistake, but one that tore the veil off completely. I sat frozen at that library desk, students, shuffling by the hum of the heater rattling overhead. My heart pounded so hard I could hear it in my ears. This was not subtle favoritism. This was a deliberate scheme. My family had not just assumed I would help. They had planned, it counted on it, written it into their blueprint for Jessica's life. The betrayal tasted metallic like blood before the wound appears. It was not shock so much as clarity. I had always known I was the one expected to carry weight, but to see it spelled out in black and white shattered any illusion of fairness. I printed the email, my hands shaking, and tucked it into a folder with my notebook of savings. I began to notice everything differently after that. Every sigh Linda released when talking about Jessica's struggles was not just a complaint, it was a manipulation. Every silence from Richard was not neutrality, it was compliance. And every smirk from Jessica when she mentioned her unstable rent was not insecurity, it was entitlement, knowing the family would bail her out again. Weeks later, the pressure grew louder. Linda cornered me after a Sunday dinner, her voice low but firm. "Your sister is having trouble. You'll need to step up soon." Richard nodded in the background, saying nothing. Jessica scrolled through her phone, tossing in a casual, "I'll probably need help with the down payment." It was not even phrased as a question. It was an assumption rooted in the plan they had already drawn. Inside, I felt a storm. The old me would have nodded, swallowed it, gone back to work with heavier shoulders. But this time I had proof. I had the email, and for the first time I had leverage. I did not confront them right away. Instead, I watched. I listened. I collected more evidence. Jessica let slip in front of an aunt that she would soon be moving into a nice condo near Lincoln Park as if it were already settled. Linda told a neighbor I was practical, dependable, the kind of daughter who always comes through. Richard joked at work, according to a cousin, that one of his daughters would be the provider and the other the dreamer. It was all aligning. My anger transformed into something sharper resolve. I decided I would not be the victim of their plan. If they thought I was predictable, that I would quietly obey, they had miscalculated. I began to imagine alternatives. I spoke with a realtor, discreetly exploring listings not near Lincoln Park, but in Lakeview, a quieter neighborhood where I could breathe. I researched mortgage options, surprised to find that my steady work history and savings put me in a position stronger than I had realized. I felt a flicker of excitement, the possibility that my sacrifices could finally materialize into something tangible, something mine. Yet I stayed silent at home. When Linda dropped hints, I let them pass. When Jessica joked about decorating her future condo, I smiled without answering. Inside, though, the decision was forming. I would flip the script. I would let them believe I was pliant, even as I prepared to shatter their expectations. The turning point was not just discovering the email. It was realizing that silence could be a weapon. They had always counted on me to be loud with effort, but quiet with resistance. For once, I chose to let them underestimate me. As the holidays approached, the tension mounted. Jessica's bills piled higher. Linda's sighs grew heavier. Richard's silence deepened. The stage was being set for confrontation, but I no longer feared it. I had endured years of neglect, years of sacrifice. Now I had evident savings and a plan. That Christmas dinner, when Jessica's nails tore my face and Linda's words demanded my future, I already knew the truth. The turning point had happened weeks before in the quiet hum of a library when an email meant for Richard landed in my inbox. That mistake gave me power they never imagined I could wield. I pressed the napkin to my cheek that night, blood staining white, and I laughed because I was no longer the powerless one. I was the daughter who had been forced to survive, and now I was the daughter who would not bend. After the email landed in my lap, nothing about my family felt the same. I went through the motions, but every interaction was sharpened by the knowledge that they saw me not as a daughter, not as a sister, but as an asset to be used. What had always been implied was now confirmed, and their efforts to tighten their grip on me grew more obvious with each passing week. Linda became relentless. She scrutinized my spending as if my paycheck was hers to audit. When I bought a new pair of sneakers, the cheapest ones I could find at a discount outlet, she frowned. "Shouldn't you be saving that money? Jessica needs help with her rent this month." Her words were sugar-coated, but the message was acidic. Nothing I earned belonged to me. It was all provisional, waiting to be redirected towards Jessica's needs. Jessica's behavior escalated too. She grew bolder, lazier, more entitled perhaps, sensing that Mom and Dad had locked me into their scheme. She left her dirty laundry in my car after I gave her a ride, then laughed when I protested. She borrowed sweaters without asking, returning them stained. She even told a mutual friend that I was stingy, that I hoarded money while she struggled. Hearing that made my blood boil, but I said nothing. I was learning the art of silence, of letting her dig her own hole while I gathered evidence. I started recording. When Linda pressed me to contribute to the so-called family fund money that mysteriously never reached the electric bill but always seemed to result in Jessica's new handbag, I pressed record on my phone hidden in my pocket. When Jessica ranted that I owed her because she was the older sister, I saved the message. Each clip, each screenshot became another brick in the fortress I was building. The pressure at family dinners became suffocating. Linda leaned across the table one night, her eyes sharp. "Jessica deserves stability. She is under so much stress." "You're doing well, Samantha. You can carry a little more." Richard's silence was complicit, his eyes fixed on his plate as if mashed potatoes were more important than his daughter's dignity. I felt the familiar urge to shrink, to nod, to give in. But this time I simply listened, storing the moment for later. Jessica grew reckless. One evening, she stormed into my apartment uninvited, complaining that she had been locked out of her place. She knocked a stack of textbooks off my desk, scattering papers across the floor. "Look at you," she sneered, studying like some desperate nobody. "You'll end up nowhere." I bit my tongue, bent to pick up my papers, and pressed record again. The hardest part was pretending nothing had changed. I still worked my shifts, still updated my notebook of savings, still kept my head down in class. Outwardly, I was the same dependable Samantha. Inside, though, I was preparing for war. Each insult, each demand, each attempt to control me was fuel. The email had opened my eyes, but the escalation in their behavior steeled my resolve. They thought they were tightening their grip, but what they were really doing was handing me rope to bind them later. Every manipulation became evidence. Every cruel word became testimony. Around this time, Linda began floating the idea of a family meeting after Christmas. "We need to discuss Jessica's future," she told me, her tone deceptively soft. It was not a suggestion. It was a summons. I nodded calmly, hiding the storm inside. Jessica, emboldened, started telling relatives that she would soon be moving into a condo near Lincoln Park. She acted as if it were already hers, showing them pictures on her phone, laughing about how she would decorate. A cousin mentioned it to me at the grocery store, pity in her eyes. I smiled and said nothing. At night, in the silence of my apartment, I replayed recordings and reread the email. My anger no longer burned out of control. It had cooled into something steadier, something sharper. I was no longer a child pleading for fairness. I was a strategist waiting for the right moment. The weight of years pressed down on me, but for the first time, I felt it shifting. I was not simply carrying it anymore. I was learning how to use it as leverage. The week before Christmas, Linda cornered me again. Her words were deliberate, almost rehearsed. "You'll buy a place soon, Samantha. You'll do the right thing. Jessica deserves that." I looked her in the eye for the first time in years and simply said, "We'll see." The flicker of confusion that crossed her face was almost enough to sustain me. Still, the escalation had taken a toll. I was exhausted from playing both roles, the dutiful daughter on the surface and the silent collector of evidence beneath. There were moments when I wanted to scream, to slam my notebook on the table and shout the truth, but I waited. I knew Christmas dinner would be the stage. The night before, Jessica sent me a text dripping with entitlement. "Don't embarrass the family tomorrow, just agree. It'll be easier for everyone." I stared at the screen, my hands shaking, then saved the message with the others. If you've ever had your own family circle, you like wolves pressing closer until you can barely breathe. You know that claustrophobia. You know the way your chest tightens, the way your voice catches, the way you start to wonder if escape is even possible. That was the air I lived in, thick and suffocating. But I also knew something they didn't. I had already found my exit. By the time I walked into Grandma's house in Troy on Christmas night, the decision was sealed. They thought they were escalating control. In reality, they were walking straight into their own undoing. Christmas night in Troy was colder than I expected. The Hudson River winds swept down the street as I walked toward my grandmother's house, the kind of biting chill that stung the skin and seeped into bones. Inside, though, the air was heavy in a different way. The house was dressed in garlands and soft yellow lights, the smell of ham and cinnamon rolls drifting through the dining room. On the surface, it looked like tradition. Beneath it, I could feel the storm waiting. Grandma greeted me with a warm hug, her frail hands trembling slightly, her voice soft with genuine love. For a moment, I wanted to cling to her kindness, but as soon as I stepped into the dining room, reality snapped back. Linda sat at the head of the table, Richard beside her, his face already wearing that checked-out expression I knew too well. Jessica leaned back in her chair, a glass of red wine tilted dangerously in her hand, her cheeks flushed. Her eyes found mine with a smirk that told me she was ready to perform. The meal started quietly, forced small talk, layered over tension so thick it was almost visible. I picked at my plate, nodding when spoken to, but mostly I watched. Linda's glances at Richard, the way Jessica's laughter rang too loudly, the silence stretching just a bit too long after every exchange. They were waiting for the moment. Halfway through dessert, Linda's fork clinked against her plate. She leaned forward, her voice low, cutting through the chatter. "Samantha, we've been patient. It's time we discuss Jessica's future." My chest tightened, but I kept my face calm. She continued, her words gaining force. "Your sister cannot keep struggling like this. It's your duty to help. You will put your savings toward a place she can live in." The room fell silent. Every relative turned toward me. Forks paused, mid-air, eyes wide. I felt the spotlight slam onto my shoulders. Before I could answer, Jessica slammed her glass down, wine splattering across the tablecloth. She rose unsteadily, her voice sharp and raw. "You've always been useless, Samantha. Always. And now you think you're better than me." Her words cut, but not as sharply as what came next. In a sudden lunge, she crossed the space between us, her nails clawing across my cheek. Pain seared hot and immediate. I felt the skin tear, warm blood sliding down my face. Gasps erupted around the table. Plates clattered as relatives recoiled. Someone shouted her name, but no one moved to stop her. For a heartbeat, the world slowed. My hand went to my cheek, feeling the sting, the wetness, the undeniable mark of her rage. The Samantha they expected would have cried, would have crumbled, would have begged for peace. But that girl was gone. Instead, I laughed. The sound burst out, echoing through the room louder than Jessica's shrieks. It startled even me, a laugh rich with release, with defiance, with years of swallowed pain finally turning into something uncontainable. I met Jessica's wild eyes with a smile she could not understand, blood staining my teeth as I spoke. "The useless one isn't me." I pulled my phone from my pocket with steady hands and slid it onto the table. One tap and the email my mother had mistakenly CC'd me filled the screen. I pressed play on a recording. Linda's voice unmistakable. "Samantha will do it. Jessica deserves a break." The words filled the room like smoke curling into every corner, choking the silence. The color drained from Linda's face. Richard shifted uncomfortably, his lips parting as if to protest, but no sound came out. Jessica's smirk collapsed, replaced with panic. The relatives sat frozen, eyes darting between the phone and the blood on my face. Daniel, my lawyer, had agreed to come at my request. He had been sitting quietly at the far end of the table observing. Now he cleared his throat, his tone calm but cutting. "There is no legal ground for your threats. If you continue to pressure Samantha, you could face charges yourselves." His words landed like hammer blows. Chaos erupted. Linda's voice cracked as she launched into a guilt trip. "How could you do this to family? How could you betray us?" Richard tried to soften his words hollow. "We just want what's best for both of you." Jessica screamed, accusing me of humiliating her, of ruining her life. Her hands trembled, her wine glass shattering against the floor. I stayed seated, napkin pressed to my cheek, my smile never faltering. The power had shifted, and they knew it. Every threat, every manipulation, every plan had unraveled in front of the very people they had hoped to impress. For years, I had been their scapegoat, their silent mule, their afterthought. In that moment, I became their mirror. I reflected back the truth they had hidden behind layers of excuses. The useless one was not me. It was Jessica, shielded her whole life, never facing consequence until now. The shouting continued, but I no longer heard it. My mind was steady, my heart strangely calm. Blood still dripped, but it felt less like a wound and more like a badge. This was the night everything changed. When the storm finally broke, when chairs scraped back and relatives stumbled out in shock, I stayed behind. I cleaned my face in the bathroom mirror, the scratch raw and red, and I looked at myself for the first time as someone free. The confrontation had not destroyed me. It had revealed me. Later that night, as I walked back into the cold Troy air, the stars sharp above, I understood the full weight of what had just happened. My family thought they had orchestrated my compliance. Instead, they had staged their own downfall. That Christmas dinner was brutal, yes, but it was also the night the cage door opened and I stepped out laughing. When I left Grandma's house in Troy that night, the cold air hit my face like a baptism. My cheeks still throbbed where Jessica's nails had torn into me, but the sting was nothing compared to the fire burning inside. For the first time, I walked away from a family dinner, not carrying their weight, but carrying proof. They had schemed in the shadows for years, convinced that my silence would protect them. Now I held the power to expose them, and I intended to use it. Back in Albany, I sat in my small apartment, the glow of Christmas lights from across the street flickering through the blinds. My phone buzzed with missed calls and angry texts from Linda, from Jessica, even from Richard, who rarely bothered to type more than a few words. Their messages swung wildly between guilt and threat. "Samantha, how could you humiliate us like that? You've torn this family apart. If you go public with lies, we'll make sure you regret it." My hands trembled as I read them, but not from fear, from resolve. The next day, I met my cousin Vanessa at a coffee shop near Lark Street. She had been the only family member to ever show me genuine kindness, and she had already heard the rumors swirling from last night's chaos. Her eyes widened when I pulled out the printed email, the recordings the text Jessica had sent me, ordering me not to embarrass the family. Vanessa's jaw tightened. "You can't keep this in the dark anymore," she said. "They've been playing you for years. Show everyone." That afternoon, I opened my laptop, heart pounding, and logged into Facebook. My fingers hovered over the keyboard, hesitation pressing in. Did I really want to make this public? Did I want relatives, neighbors, classmates, even strangers to see the ugliness I had endured? But then I remembered Jessica's claws, Linda's threats, Richard's silence. I remembered the suffocation of every family dinner where I was invisible, and I realized that exposing the truth was not just about revenge. It was about freedom. I began simply. I posted a photo of the sunset from my apartment balcony, the caption reading, "I earned every inch of this view through years of work sacrifice and persistence. This is mine." I expected a few likes, maybe a comment or two. Instead, the post exploded. Friends from school congratulated me. Former coworkers wrote messages of pride. Some joked about coming over for hot cocoa, but buried among the congratulations were messages from relatives. Confusion, anger, demands. "Why didn't you tell us? Did you really buy a place without helping Jessica?" I didn't answer. Instead, I prepared the hammer. The following evening, I uploaded a screenshot of the email Linda had mistakenly CC'd me along with a caption. For those asking questions, here is the truth. No commentary, no embellishment, just raw evidence. Within minutes, the comments flooded in. Cousins tagged each other, relatives shared the post. The ripple spread faster than I imagined. Some relatives who had always sided with Linda fell silent. Others, to my shock, messaged me privately with apologies. I never realized how bad it was, one aunt wrote. I should have seen it sooner. The lies Jessica had spun for years, stories about me being cold, selfish withholding, crumbled under the weight of undeniable proof. Jessica panicked. Within hours, she launched a fundraiser online titled Help Jessica Find a Home. The description painted her as the victim, a struggling sister betrayed by a greedy sibling who refused to help. She posted pictures of herself looking forlorn, adding lines about how she had nowhere to turn. For a moment, I worried. Would people believe her? Would they fall for the performance my family had perfected? But the fundraiser backfired spectacularly. Friends from high school called her out in the comments, reminding everyone of her nights out at bars, her designer handbags, her endless excuses. Strangers mocked the entitlement dripping from her story. Donations barely trickled in $50 total before the backlash grew unbearable. By the next morning, she had deleted the fundraiser and locked her social media accounts. Linda tried damage control. She sent long texts to relatives claiming the email was misunderstood, that I had twisted her words. But the screenshots spoke louder than her explanations. One cousin forwarded me a group chat where Richard ranted about my betrayal, insisting I had embarrassed the family for attention. The irony stung, but also fueled me. For once, their anger was not crushing me. It was exposing them. The public reveal changed everything. At church, Linda was met with cold stares. The community that once praised her perfect family now whispered behind her back. Richard's colleagues at GE avoided his lunch table, tired of his defensive tirades. Jessica, stripped of her golden child aura, was forced to take a retail job at Colony Center Mall. I heard from a friend who spotted her folding jeans, her expression sour as she complained to coworkers about unfairness. For me, the shift was like breathing fresh air for the first time. I no longer answered their calls or texts. My phone was filled with messages I ignored, their desperation growing sharper. Samantha, you've made your point. Now take it down. Please, we can fix this. But I knew better. Taking it down would mean giving them back control. Leaving it up meant freedom. Still, I was careful. Daniel, my lawyer, reminded me to document everything. I saved every message, every voicemail. I even added extra locks to my apartment and updated my passwords. Linda had threatened before. I knew better than to underestimate her desperation now that the facade had cracked. When relatives asked me why I had done it, I told them the truth. Because silence had protected the wrong people for too long. Because the only way to stop the cycle was to drag it into the light. And because I was done carrying shame that was never mine. The aftermath was messy, but it was necessary. Jessica's reputation collapsed. Linda's authority crumbled. Richard's silence was no longer mistaken for wisdom. For once, the consequences landed where they belonged. And me, I discovered that speaking out was not just survival. It was victory. The weeks that followed my public reveal were a blur of whispers, fallout, and consequences that rippled far beyond what I had imagined. When I pressed post on that screenshot of Linda's email, I thought I was simply reclaiming my truth. What I had not anticipated was how quickly that truth would spread, how thoroughly it would dismantle the image my parents and Jessica had worked so hard to maintain, and how it would alter every corner of our family's existence. At first, there was silence, the kind of heavy, disbelieving quiet that settles before a storm. A few relatives called to check in, their voices hushed, almost embarrassed. They told me the family group chats were buzzing, that Linda was in full denial, insisting the email had been misinterpreted, but nobody could deny the words that had come directly from her account. Samantha will do it. Jessica deserves a break. It was too plain, too clear, too damning. Within days, the silence broke into chaos. My phone lit up with voicemails, Linda sobbing, accusing me of betrayal, of humiliating her in front of everyone she knew. "You've destroyed us, Samantha. Do you realize what you've done?" Richard's messages were sharper, colder. "You are ungrateful. Family loyalty means nothing to you." And Jessica's texts dripped with venom. "You've ruined my life." I hope you're proud. Each message was a twisted mirror of the years they had spent bending me into submission, but now the reflection no longer held power over me. Word spread quickly in Albany. Linda had built her identity around being the matriarch of a perfect family, a respected woman in the church community. The Sunday after my post, she arrived at service dressed impeccably as always, but the whispers began before she even stepped through the door. Some parishioners avoided her. Others stared openly. A few approached with stiff smiles that did not reach their eyes. I heard from a friend that she left early, her face pale, her hands shaking. The pedestal she had stood on for decades had crumbled in a matter of days. Richard's world was no kinder. At General Electric in Schenectady, his co-workers had seen the posts too. Some had relatives who knew me or had children who had gone to school with Jessica. The story spread like wildfire through break rooms and cafeteria tables. Once respected for his steady work ethic, Richard now faced awkward silences when he tried to join conversations. Some colleagues openly questioned his judgment. Others distanced themselves entirely tired of hearing him defend the indefensible. For a man who thrived on invisibility, this new kind of attention was unbearable, and Jessica, the golden child who had never faced consequences, found herself stumbling into reality for the first time. Her attempt at an online fundraiser had backfired spectacularly, leaving her the subject of ridicule among friends and strangers alike. With her social media locked and her reputation shredded, she had no choice but to seek actual work. The only job she could find was at a retail store in Colony Center Mall. A cousin told me she looked miserable folding jeans behind a counter, muttering complaints about long hours and low pay. Customers who recognized her from the drama whispered some, even laughed quietly as she scowled. For someone who had lived her life believing she was destined for greatness without effort, the humiliation was cutting. The deeper consequence, though, was the shift within the extended family. Relatives who had long ignored the imbalance began rethinking everything. Aunts who once praised Jessica's creativity now questioned how much they had overlooked. Cousins who had resented my distance messaged apologies, admitting they had believed the narrative Linda spun about me being cold and selfish. Family gatherings became fractured. Invitations were selective. Sides were drawn, though few openly sided with Linda anymore. The evidence was too clear, too damning. Inside my own small apartment, I watched it unfold with a mixture of relief and exhaustion. The storm I had unleashed was bigger than me, but for once it was not crushing me. It was clearing space. For the first time, I could breathe without bracing for the next demand. Still, the fallout was not without its darker corners. Linda and Richard tried one last desperate tactic, a legal notice delivered in a thick envelope, accusing me of defrauding the family by buying a condo for myself. They claimed I had promised it to Jessica, demanding I transfer ownership or face damages for her so-called emotional distress. The letter was laughable, but it shook me for a moment. I called Daniel my lawyer, my voice trembling. He read it, chuckled, and reassured me. This is harassment dressed up as legal jargon. No court would touch it. If they push further, we counter with emotional distress and legal fees. His calm certainty steadied me. I sent back a certified response drafted by Daniel, warning that any further attempts to intimidate me would result in legal action against them. It was a line in the sand. After that, the letters stopped. The personal consequences were harder to quantify, but just as real. Linda's health began to falter. Vanessa told me that the stress of the scandal triggered migraines so severe that she ended up in urgent care one night. Richard retreated even further into silence, isolating himself from friends. Jessica spiraled deeper, racking up credit card debt she could no longer pay, her once vibrant circle of friends dwindling as people grew tired of her entitlement. There were nights I lay awake wondering if I had gone too far. The guilt crept in, whispering that maybe I had broken something beyond repair. But then I would replay Jessica's claws on my face, Linda's threats of jail, Richard's silence, and I knew the truth. I had not broken the family. They had broken it long ago. All I had done was reveal the cracks. The consequences reached beyond them, too. For me, doors opened quietly. people I barely knew reached out with words of encouragement. A professor at SUNY Albany pulled me aside after class saying he admired my resilience. A coworker at Duncan slipped me a note of support. Strangers online sent messages saying my story gave them courage to confront their own toxic families. In exposing my truth, I had found community in places I never expected. As winter melted into spring, the dust began to settle. Linda no longer called. Richard stopped sending terse messages. Jessica, defeated, avoided me entirely. The silence that followed was not the oppressive silence of my childhood. It was a silence of freedom. I walked by the Hudson River one evening, the sky painted pink and gold, and realized something profound. Consequences had finally landed where they belonged. Not on me, not on the child who had been forced to carry the family's weight, but on the people who had piled it there in the first place. The fallout was brutal, yes, but it was also justice. By the time spring gave way to summer, the storm had passed, at least on the surface. The chaos of that brutal Christmas, the screaming, the blood, the screenshots spreading across Facebook, the fundraiser fiasco, all of it had settled into a new kind of silence. But it was not the suffocating silence I had known my whole life, the silence of swallowing pain. It was a silence of space, of freedom of air that finally belonged to me. I moved into a small apartment near Lake George, the kind of place I used to daydream about when I lay awake in moldy Albany rentals. It was not grand, just a one-bedroom with thin walls and a balcony barely wide enough for a chair and a small table. But it was mine. The first night I slept there, I left the window open, listening to the water lap gently against the shore. The cool breeze brushed my face, and I realized I was breathing without fear of footsteps pounding in the hallway, without dread of voices demanding more. My new routine became a kind of healing ritual. I woke early, pulling on running shoes, and jogged along the lake as the sunrise painted the water pink and orange. The air smelled fresh pine and dew mixing in a way that grounded me. Afterward, I would stop at a local coffee shop where I had picked up part-time work. The owners, a kind older couple, treated me not as a mule to carry weight, but as part of a team. They asked about my classes, about my dreams. I found myself laughing more easily, conversations light instead of laced with tension. In the evenings, I sat on the balcony with a book or my notebook, now repurposed not for tracking desperate savings, but for writing plans, goals, reflections. Sometimes I wrote about the past, the bruises no one had seen, the years of being invisible. Other times I wrote about the future, sketching ideas for opening my own business one day, maybe even a cafe of my own. The physical wound on my face healed quickly, the scratch fading into a faint line that only I noticed. But the emotional wounds, those ran deeper. Some nights when the wind rattled the window, I would flash back to Jessica lunging across the table, her scream of useless echoing in my ears. I would remember Linda's cold snarl, Richard's empty silence. For a moment, I would feel the old weight pressing down. Then I would touch the healed skin on my cheek and remind myself I survived. I won. The fallout for them continued to unfold, though I no longer tracked it obsessively. Vanessa updated me occasionally. Linda's migraines persisted, and her standing in the church community never recovered. Richard grew more withdrawn at work, his colleagues weary of his bitterness. Jessica, still at Colony Center Mall, complained constantly, her debts mounting, her social circle gone. The golden glow she once carried had dimmed to ash. I did not rejoice in their suffering, not exactly. It was not triumph I felt, but clarity. For years I had carried their consequences. Every bill, every sacrifice, every burden meant for Jessica had been shifted onto me. Now finally they were carrying their own. That balance, harsh as it was, felt like justice. In quiet moments, I reflected on the lessons those years had carved into me. I learned that family can be the source of deepest wounds, but also that blood does not define worth. I learned that silence when chosen can be a shield, but when imposed, it can be a prison. I learned that resilience is not built by being celebrated, but by surviving neglect. And most of all, I learned that freedom sometimes means walking away, even from the people who gave you life. One evening in July, as fireworks burst across the lake for Independence Day, I stood on my balcony and thought about the word freedom. For most of my life, freedom had seemed impossible, a luxury reserved for Jessica while I toiled. But watching the sparks scatter across the night sky, I realized freedom was not given. It was taken, claimed, earned through laughter that defied blood and bruises. Friends began to notice the change in me. At school, professors remarked on my sharper focus, my confidence in class discussions. At work, customers told me I smiled differently now, more openly, less guarded. Vanessa visited one weekend, and as we sat by the water, she said quietly, "You look lighter, Samantha, like the weight finally slipped off your shoulders." I smiled, realizing she was right. I also began to dream again. For years, my only goal had been survival, scraping together enough to make it through the next semester, the next rent payment, the next holiday disaster. Now, with space to breathe, I allowed myself to imagine more. I pictured opening a cafe near the lake, a place with warm lighting and mismatched chairs where students could study and families could gather. I pictured walls lined with books, the smell of cinnamon and coffee drifting out the door. It was still far off, but the dream felt possible, no longer a fantasy crushed under guilt. Looking back, I sometimes wondered what would have happened if Linda had never CC'd me on that email. Would I still be grinding silently, saving for a condo they planned to hand over to Jessica? Would I have collapsed under the weight of their demands? The thought chilled me. That mistake, that single accident had opened my eyes. It had set me free. Closure did not come all at once. It came in small moments, turning off my phone when Linda's number flashed, ignoring Richard's cold emails, blocking Jessica's desperate texts. It came in choosing not to attend family gatherings even when guilt tugged at me. It came in walking by Colony Center Mall one day, seeing Jessica behind the counter, her face twisted in a scowl, and realizing I felt nothing. Not anger, not triumph, just distance. The final piece of closure came in an act of giving, but on my own terms. I donated $500 to a local nonprofit that supported young entrepreneurs, a nod to the teenager I had been scraping by with no support. As I handed over the check, I felt a surge of peace. For once, my money was going where I wanted, not where others demanded. I will not pretend everything is perfect. The scars remain. Trust is hard. Holidays are still complicated. But I live with a clarity I never had before. I know my worth, and I know the cost of letting others define it. I am no longer the daughter who swallowed pain in silence. I am the woman who laughed through blood, who turned exposure into liberation. When people ask me about that Christmas now, I tell them the truth. It was brutal. Yes, it was painful. But it was also the night I was freed. Freed from manipulation, from control, from the belief that I had to carry what was never mine. Brutal Christmas didn't break me. It rebuilt me. And every step I take now along the shores of Lake George, every sunrise I watch with clear eyes, every laugh that rises from my chest without fear, that is proof that I am no longer useless. I never was.